1:10 now. Okay, so public transport planning themes from a century of Whanganui services. So my first theme is that branching divides frequency, which will make sense in a moment. So first thing I want to show you, I've made some maps recently of Whanganui's public transport network in the past. And what I've done with these maps is I have colour-coded the network by frequency. That's really important because there is a very big difference standing beside a bus route that goes every 15 minutes to a bus route that goes every hour or every 2 hours. The reality is if you are standing beside a bus route that goes every 2 hours, most of the time that route does not exist for you and it's not actually an option to use it. The other thing that's a big misconception in public transport, we often think about making a route where it's very fast for you to get from point A to point B. But in public transport, the biggest part of your journey time is often the waiting time. So the calculation we use when we plan a route is the time it takes you to get somewhere is actually the time it takes sitting on the bus getting from point A to point B plus half of the time between services. So for example, I live in Gonville, and once I'm on the bus from the bus stop to Trafalgar Square, it only takes 8 minutes. Yeah. But if the bus only goes 2 hours, then my average travel time is 1 hour 8 minutes. That's a rule of thumb. So when we brought in the tide, which goes every 20 minutes, that reduced my personal waiting time to 8 minutes plus 10 minutes, which is half the frequency. So 18 minutes. Although I also have a 6-minute walk to my bus stop, so I have to add that in as well. So my total journey time about 26 minutes, but that's a big improvement from an hour 8 minutes. So that's why I've color-coded this with frequency. And the color code here is that red means frequent, and generally it means a bus or a tram in this case every 15 minutes. So in the tram system in 1926, if you lived on Dublin Street, or if you lived between town and the hospital, or if you lived near the old Whanganui East Railway Station or near the Whanganui East shops, you could expect a tram to be going past every 15 minutes. And every 15 minutes is a magic number, in that we think that's about the time at which people no longer need to think about a timetable. They just walk there, and because your average waiting time on a 15-minute route is 7.5 minutes. And for most people, they don't mind that. With the tide, we were trying to get to 15 minutes. We couldn't quite get there. We got to 20. That means an average wait of 10 minutes. That's not too bad. But certainly 15 minutes is sort of the standard, and now in Auckland, there are routes that have a 3-minute frequency, lots of routes that have a less than 10-minute frequency. Blue here means every half hour, green means every hour, and purple every 2 hours or less, so just 4 services a day. So 1926 is really interesting for the scope of Whanganui's public transport operations. It's when we'd sort of completed everything. So not only did we have all of the tram lines that we would build, but we also had, I'm just actually going to take these out, the 2-hourly routes out for a moment, because this is the bones of things. So we had finished the tram system, which basically, this is everywhere that the tram system covered. We still had our first public transport in Whanganui, which was the Castle Cliff Railway. But by this time, this was just doing sort of express services for workers. And it was coming into trouble because it was competing with these trams. And it was having a lot of trouble because the trams went every 15 minutes in some places, or every half hour. But because the railway only went four times a day. Usually you would probably just take your luck going over to a tram stop. And of course we had finished the Jury Hill elevator. And the amazing thing about the Jury Hill elevator, my conservative estimate about our frequency, even today, is 7.5 minutes. So as good as a bus route in Auckland. Because one way that you can get frequency is to put more buses or vehicles onto the route. The other way you can get frequency is to make the route very short. And our route is 66 metres. So that's quite genius, because it does mean that with only one operator, an operator that doesn't even need a driver's licence, we can offer a very good frequency.
But is that the Jury Hill one? Is that including you walk up the tower, the tunnel?
That's a very good point. So yes, there's more walking involved.
Yeah.
But once you get to the elevator itself, you press the button. The longest I think you'll wait is about 7.5 minutes, and usually it's faster than that. We can take a trip. The trip takes us 55 seconds. So.
I don't think it's sped up.
It hasn't sped up, no. And then the other thing here. So we had the tram system, we had we had the elevator, we had the railway. In 1926, the Tramways Department invested in buses. So they started an hourly bus to St John's Hill, so very close to where we are. And this went every hour, and you can see it had this interesting route, so straight up the Ave. This was going to be the route of a tram, of course, but by this time, if you hadn't built it by the end of the First World War, you were very unlikely to build it. Palmerston North found this because they had planned the building of their tram system for just after World War I, and of course it never happened. But the bus provided a very good service. It was only every hour, so a lot less frequent than the other routes. But notice it went up through the kind of older part of St John's Hill. The way that you can tell it's older is that it has grid-based streets. Because as we got more and more into the 20th century, we started to design streets that were a bit more curvaceous, and they didn't have grids. Now that's very important, because when you have buses, a very important thing you need is a turnaround. A bus can't really do a 3-point turn. It's just not a good idea. The drivers don't like doing it. People don't like seeing it outside their house. So what is really interesting, and I don't know if this was deliberate in the street design of St John's Hill, is that the buses had a natural turnaround on Brassey Road and Virginia Road. So that's quite interesting. So back then, I think the retreat was here at that time, or some of the buildings were here. So if you were a sister, you could take that bus and walk down.
It was here in 1912.
1912, there you go. So the other bus, they had another experiment. So these were all really well used. So there were 3.5 million boardings on public transport in 1926. Now, to give you a sense of scale, we currently are up to just under 200,000 boardings a year on our current bus system. So 3.5 million, and remember our population was only 26,000 at that point. So the way that we measure how well used your public transport system is now is how many boardings per person per year. If you take the population and you take the boardings and you divide it by the population. So at that time, we did 132 boardings per person in Whanganui per year. Now, today, the best performing public transport system in New Zealand is Wellington, and they're actually the third best used public transport system in Australasia. They take 70 boardings per person per year. So at this time, we were doing even more than that. But of course, so was Wellington. Auckland at this time did close to 300 boardings per person per year. So we had very high public transport use, of course. They did also try an experiment in 1926, a very interesting one. they introduced 3 extra bus routes. One of them was this very interesting route that went from Springvale around Fox Road all the way through town and then came out the other side onto the number 3 line.
Wow.
They introduced a bus to Jury Hill, and this is, I'm always looking at the historic papers to do with the elevator, and there were big fights between you had these big heated meetings where you had Jury Hill residents, you had the owners of the Jury Hill elevator, and you had councillors who were in support of this new bus route. And the councillor boldly claimed that the elevator's time was up and that buses were the future. So of course the elevator weren't very happy about a bus coming and competing with them. And then there was another route here which went up to the sort of far end following the river of Whanganui East. Now these routes look very good. The problem is they could only afford about 4 buses. Buses were very, they were like buying a Tesla today. They were exciting new technology. And because they only had 4 buses, they could only run about 4 services a day on each of these lines. And what happened? In Jury Hill, people weighed it up and subconsciously they go, well, actually my average waiting time for this bus is an hour because it only goes every 2 hours. It's an 800-metre walk from here to the start of the elevator. A lot of them would just go, well, I can walk straight to the elevator and I can be there. Elevator itself, at this time, took more boardings than our entire bus network does today. So it took around 240,000 boardings a year. So now I'm getting back to my original point, which is that branching divides frequency. So, and the place I want to talk about here is Gonville. Because I often say that Whanganui was very well planned for public transport, and that's mostly true. But there were always, what was always difficult is if you plan where the houses go and then try to plan where the buses or the trams go afterwards, because then you get into trouble. And what happened with Gonville, where I live and feel very proud of, but in Gonville, people started building houses before this stuff could be worked out. Now, so what we ended up with in Gonville is a branch. So from this point, Gonville Junction, you had 15-minute frequency. There was a tram that went every 15 minutes to town. Now, ideally, you would have chosen one road that was equidistant and basically in the middle, that tram could have gone along, and then everyone would have been a 400 or 600 metre walk from the tram, and that meant that everyone would be able to have 15-minute frequency, and they'd simply have to walk a little bit, and then they had a 7.5 minute wait. But because Gonville had been developed a little bit haphazardly, and because there's not always a good grid for you to travel from one street to the other, they had to create 2 lines. And that meant that if you lived down Tawa Street, you had a tram every half hour, and same if you were on Elmer Road. So in some ways the best places to live were near the hospital, where you had that 15-minute frequency, or near the junction, where the junction tavern is today. And that's a really consistent rule when we're planning public transport. So here's a branch. On this line here, I've got 15-minute frequency, and so I'm in a very good position for public transport. Sometimes what we do is at the end of a line, we split it into 1, 2, or 3 branches. But if we do, that means that everybody living on these lines only has a bus every 45 minutes. So that's a really important thing to remember, because when you're in a car, if you have 3 options to get from A to B, it makes no difference which of them you take. Your travel time, if the travel time is relatively similar, there's no difference to you because you get in your car anytime. The same is true when you're walking, the same is true when you're cycling. So road planners over the years have tended to make lots of routes to get to the same place. Why? Because that reduces traffic, because you can spread the flow. In public transport, we have to think differently. If there are 3 roads to get somewhere, in public transport, it's not a good idea to use all of them. It's a much better idea to choose one that everyone can walk to, because then we can make it 3 times more frequent. That has some advantages though, because public transport can save your system money, because if you have a system where everyone needs to get around by a car, then to reduce traffic you've got to have lots of roads, and all of those roads cost a lot to re-asphalt every year and to maintain. If you have a public transport system, we think that you need a public transport route ideally every 800 metres. Now at the moment we have roads pretty much every 100 metres. So by having a public transport system every 800 metres, you can reduce a lot of the load on your road system, and it can end up cheaper to operate. Okay, how are we doing for time? So I'll jump a little bit ahead through the next couple of slides to just show you some other pictures of how the Whanganui network evolved. A couple of little pictures here though before I do. So here's the trams and trailers. So in 1926, the system was so well used that they had to start attaching second trams on the back. There's a little bit of the Gonville to Castlecliff tram line being built, and of course the heroic Puffing Billy, which was a steam-driven tram. They used that to build the rails as they were going. And here's something that's in the Whanganui archives: a Castlecliff Railway season ticket. My next theme is about a network. So, and this is a really important point. At the moment, when we looked at building the Tide, we worked on one route because it was about what we thought we could do politically. We thought that it would be possible for us to create one new route that used a different approach, rather than sort of 2-hourly, what we call a coverage route. We wanted to try a route that was relatively frequent, but the staff were quite unsure about the idea, and so they wanted to test it. So we started with one, but ideally you have more than one route, and this is why. So when you have one route, let's say it costs you $1,000 to run, and 1,000 people use it. The math says that if you double the frequency of this line, you will get more people using it. But we think that the elasticity is such that you will probably get 1.5 times the amount of people using it if you double the frequency. So if we double this, then it's now costs us $2,000, because doubling the route frequency always just doubles the cost, pretty much. But then we have 1,500 people using it. So generally it's costing us more per person. Now the Tide's actually done a little bit better than that, and that's partially because it's a really big change and it's had some good marketing, and it's gotten a little bit closer to a better scale here. But were you to do no marketing, were you to just run the bus more frequently, that's about what we can expect as an average. But if we look at this differently, now if we create a second route, Now, our original cost to have 2 routes would be $2,000. And from here to here, we can now expect 1,500, and from here to here, we can expect 1,500. But because we've now created some new networks, if these are frequent routes, and frequent enough that people can transfer in the middle, then we've actually created many more points that people can travel to. So now, instead of 2 places that we can get to, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 6 times 1,500 is 9,000. So when you have a network and you increase frequency across the network, then you get better value for money. One of the interesting things about the Whanganui network over time, so I'm going to look at, I'll jump forward 30 years, so this is near the end of the tram system in Whanganui. It's obviously a very famous image. It's a really great picture of transport in Whanganui in the 40s. It's 1947, you've got lots of people taking the tram, you've got road space so that people can safely ride their bikes even without helmets. And you've got the Jericho elevator, which some of these people may have cycled from. And this is what the routes looked like. So, in some ways, I actually prefer, there had been some streamlining and there'd been some cost difficulties between 1926 and 1946. But some things had improved. So one of the problems with the network in 1926, in my view, was that they had created this branching problem for Glasgow Street as well. So there were 2 ways to get to Aramore in 1926. There was one route which went up Bell Street and along the river, and then there was one route that went to Aramore via Victoria Ave and Glasgow Street. But that creates your branching problem. It meant that there was only a bus or a tram every half hour on Glasgow Street. In 1946, in the 1930s, they removed this line and they simplified the network a bit. So now we had a new line that went straight through Dublin Street to get to Whanganui East, and it went every 20 minutes. And the Aramore line went every 15 minutes, and it always went along Glasgow Street. So actually more people, especially in this really highly populated area of town, had access to 15-minute or 20-minute tram frequency. And I think on the whole it worked together really well as a network. And what you notice as well, those 3 big interesting purple routes, the bus routes, they only survived for 3 years, as did the bus to Jury Hill. But what did survive was the St John's Hill bus, which was still doing quite well at this time. It had changed a little bit. You notice that rather than going up here, it was now going through College Estate on Grey Street.
It was, see the Whanganui East route
Yeah.
going up to, now see down below, where you've got your thing now,
Yeah.
in there. That was actually a long way from the bus route.
Yeah.
It was a heck of a walk, and for a mum with children,
Yes.
maybe one in a pushchair and a pram and stuff, that route was not able to be used by a lot of people in Whanganui East.
Yes.
I was growing up in those late 1940s in Whanganui East,
Oh wow.
and we did a heck of a lot of walking to and from the bus.
Yes.
Because we lived down off the river down below.
Yes. And that's a really, really good point. So there was a similar problem in Whanganui East as there was to Gonville.
Yeah.
And that's that, so from a public transport planning point of view, the best neighbourhoods for public transport are Aramore and Castlecliff. And you can see why when you look at Aramore here, because everybody is a 400 to 600 metre walk from the main tram line. Now, the way that they planned Whanganui East, they didn't think about it so much. With only one route, suddenly people up here and down here are 1,000 metres walk from the tram route.
and that was where we lived. See the yellow, see where you've got Kowhai Park?
Yes.
Right there. So we lived around about there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
So
so
that-
for my mother to get us back from town,
Yeah,
we had to walk.
yeah,
She had to walk from town.
Yes. yeah. So that's always a really hard trade-off, and you can improve it. The best time to improve it is when you're planning the layout of the streets. But of course, we missed the bus there in some places. So another good spot is Castlecliff, because you can essentially get most of Castlecliff onto one bus or tram line. And because of course a second bus or tram line doubles your cost. So it's interesting to look at that and then maybe take a step further into the future. So of course the tram stopped in 1950. And we often are nostalgic about trams. They're always a great gateway for people like me to get interested in public transport, because you just think, wow, I can't believe we had that. But something that I think is actually underappreciated is our history with buses, and particularly in Whanganui. So when the Whanganui tram system closed down, it was taken over by this really interesting and very innovative private company, Greyhound Bus. And they had, what was interesting is they were a private company, but they had local shareholders. Over 500 people had shares in Greyhound, and a lot of them were businesses. So there was a pharmacy on Victoria Ave, where there's currently a pharmacy now, and they had shares in Greyhound, and they also hosted a bus stop right outside their pharmacy.
Sarni's.
Right, was that the one? Yeah.
It's on the corner of Ridgeway Street,
Okay.
opposite the
Yeah.
With the branch office.
And of course, you might already know that Whanganui Motors and the formidable Herbie Dyke had the controlling shareholder in Greyhound.
Oh, really?
But it was looking from what I can see, it was very public spirited in the way that they operated the company. They weren't always seeking profit above everything else because of that local shareholding. So taking a look at the way that they approached these things. So this is fast forwarding to 1960. Now in 1960, the buses still took 1.7 million boardings a year. So if we equate that, that's 45 trips per person per year. That's more than Dunedin or Christchurch do in public transport at the moment. So it was still an impressive company, and they did some really interesting things. So they brought back a Jury Hill route. They had an agreement with the council that they would only run the bus to Jury Hill 4 times a day, because by this time the council was running the elevator and they didn't want to lose their patronage. They introduced this new turnaround point, so you might remember the buses went down Ridgeway and they had a turning circle that included the supermarket on Mariah Lane that's now, Mariah Place that's now the ANZ. What is very interesting though, and another theme in public transport, is the stability of your network. So, but tailor-made versus ready-made. So one of the things that Greyhounds did, they were very excited that they had these buses and they were no longer constrained by the tram routes. So what they did is they started introducing deviations. So this was the basic core network. So you notice that frequencies reduced. Now you only had a bus into Whanganui East every half hour and a bus along Glasgow Street every half hour. You still had really good frequency from town to the hospital, and then from there on, it was still about half an hour frequency to get to Castlecliff. Now, I would argue that they could have afforded to have better frequency for Glasgow Street, for example. The reason they didn't is because they devoted more of their resources to route deviations. So they started introducing, they started introducing these quite complex routes where 3 times a day, most of the day, this route to Castlecliff will go on the normal route past the hospital, but 3 times a day there is the route X, and it will go up here through Smithfield Road, pass through Tupfield and come through.
Well, that was because Taipiro developed so
Yes.
quickly. So
Yeah.
a lot of young people went into houses and things.
Yeah,
And
that's
they
a really
actually
interesting.
in Taipiro. There was the population growth in that direction of the city.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because you see, there's where that interaction between house building and land planning, and it always works out better if you can be planning in advance together. And that's a lot of the work that we're trying to do, or I'm trying to do with Whanganui, is convince them to let the public transport planners in the meetings when they're talking about where the houses are going to go, so that you don't end up with these sort of difficult trade-offs. Because while this Tawhiro route, it looks like it's there and it's good to have a route there, the reality is if it only goes once or twice a day, it's not very
It's
useful
still
for people.
expanding. That area is still expanding.
Yeah, that's right. And it presents a lot of our challenge. So Whanganui was quite efficient to provide public transport for the tram days, but notice it completely ignored this area because a lot of it was farmland.
Not now.
Yeah. Okay, I will zoom ahead to questions soon. I will maybe just a couple more photos. So here's the glory days of the Greyhound bus. And this point about a stable network. So the way we think about public transport, so the way that people started thinking about public transport in the 60s and 70s, because they had buses, is they moved away from having one consistent network all the time, and you just always knew it was there, to these sorts of deviations. So if we look at the Greyhound bus timetable, notice these letters, SQ, SQ, or when you get to the Whanganui East, you've got R, you've got RX, you've got K, you've got KD. And so it became very confusing for people to know which way the bus was going to go. From the last 20, 30 years in public transport planning, we've moved more towards create one stable network, try to solve those trade-offs about your walking distance and your frequency as best you can. But once it's there, just run it in a stable way, because then people make better decisions about where to live around that network over time. Now, of course, and what felt like a big tragedy for me, I've got to have a photo of Bono from U2 on a Greyhound bus in 1986. Yeah, so we lost, so a big change happened in 1991. Cities were no longer allowed to own a bunch of buses and pay drivers. So Palmerston North, which had a public bus system, they had to close the bus system down. In Whanganui, we weren't doing that. We had a private company, but we were subsidising them, and we were essentially allowing them to have a monopoly in Whanganui. And the other thing you weren't allowed to do was to prop up a monopoly. And so when Horizons came into being in 1991, they essentially closed Greyhounds down, and they moved to taxi buses. Now the issue with taxi buses, there's a couple of issues. One is, a Toyota Hiace is a really great vehicle to travel with your family, with your sports team, or with your band. I do it a lot with bands. Great vehicle. But you are sitting thigh to thigh with people, and that's okay when it's your family or your band. It's not very appealing with total strangers. The other thing is, when these do get full, a bus can be relatively large because we make it the size we need for our one really busy service in the morning. If a Hiace with 9 seats on it gets 7, 8 people, then it has to turn down everyone else that goes past. So you ended up with people waiting at the stop, but the van was full, and they had to wait another hour for the next service. But what was really, what I loved, I met a man named Ken Forster, and he was the ticket inspector at Greyhound buses. And what's extraordinary, I went to visit him in Whanganui,
Solar buses,
is that he, when they found out they were going to have to close greyhounds down, they took a camera person out for the day to just give a day in the life of greyhounds. And I was alive in 1991. I have some memories from then. So it's very nostalgic for me to see what Whanganui looked like in the last days of greyhound bus. So here's a bus stop on the main street on U3A. And this one's going to Whanganui by Talbot Street.
This is only yesterday.
I mean, even at this time, Whanganui was doing 430,000 boardings in public transport per year.
That's just obscuring the lights.
Yeah, and we that's right, and we're getting close to 200,000 now. So what it shows to me is we have a lot more potential in public transport. And it's not as if 1991 cars are certainly an option as well.
But that was set on Brunswick Road on that sign, on the bus.
Yeah, now it says Brunswick Road because just like the trams, there was a 15-minute frequency tram to the Arawong station, and then a half frequency tram that went all the way to the park, cemetery.
Oh, yeah.
Same thing with the buses. There was one bus that went to Brunswick Road and it was more frequent, and there was another bus that went all the way to Arawong Park. So here's Ken doing his ticket inspection. But when you look at this bus to Castleford, and you really wonder how they were going to get all these people in a van 2 months later. What I love too is I remember my memories of this time are like the fluoro pinks and the kind of cool 80s clothes. But what I've forgotten is that there's these lovely older people who were probably taking trams just after the First World War and were still using buses in 1991. So here's near where I live, this is the Gonville Junction. And of course, so this is where the Alma Road bus and the Koromiko Road bus meet. So you have good frequency, which means that lots of people use that as their stop. And I do a lot of work with Adrian Barnes, our electricians, at the elevator. And what's funny to me is that he drives past at the moment and he has exactly the same logo on his van. I called him up.
Was that old house still stand?
I'm not sure now, actually. Here he is. So of course buses went down Guyton Street at this time, and what's really interesting is to count how many people get out of this bus at the end. So just a couple of points on the present and then I'll open it up to questions. So where we are with public transport at the moment is that we've got a big opportunity. Every long-term plan, it only comes every 3 years. You have an opportunity to invest in the network. And we recently won a vote to do that next year. And that would allow us to start to develop a new public transport network for Whanganui in the next 2 years. So we're hoping to go out to consultation in the next few months and show people some examples of what we could do with more budget and a bit of a network overhaul to try to solve some of those trade-offs between your frequent routes and how far you need to walk to them. Basically, we'll have a couple of different options about what we could do with further budget. People though will have the option to say, they prefer us not to spend more money on the public transport system. The only thing I point out about that, these are some modern public transport systems that have been doing really well. So Waiheke Island has 15-minute bus frequency from this point all the way down to, I'm not very good with my Waiheke knowledge, but the Strand, where the great restaurants are. So they introduced a 7 days a week, 7 till 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. 15-minute frequency bus route. It does really well. They do 70 trips per person per year in Waiheke. We currently do about 3 or 4 trips per person per year in Whanganui. So they've shown that it's not just large places. Waiheke, of course, has a population of 8,000.
But a lot of tourists. Like
A lot of tourists.
Done it, gone on the ferry, yeah.
Absolutely. So there's always things that can help a little bit. Queenstown, which also has lots of tourists, but its resident population is only 23,000. They are now the 3rd most used public transport system in New Zealand. And they only introduced this in 2017. But they've been really smart about creating a good network. So they've got really good frequency here, every 15 minutes, and then you've still got half-hour frequency to Arrowtown and out to places like Jack's Point. Nelson's also introduced a new system, and they are about the same size as Whanganui, just a little bit bigger, but they're on track to reach 1 million passengers this year. So they're a really interesting example for us. And then Hawke's Bay are planning a similar thing with 5 frequent routes, so every 20 minutes or better, and then 3 routes that go every hour to help cover those places so that you don't have to walk too far. And of course, Palmerston North introduced a system this year where they actually have 15-minute frequency in the peak times on all of these lines, and that's an all-electric bus system. But the big difference is budget. So this is the public transport service budget per person across a similar range of cities. If I was to put Wellington and Auckland here, they spend about $300 per person on public transport. So often people say, some places are too small to have public transport. The real test is to spend the same amount per person and to see how much you can do with that budget. And often then that comes down to how well your street layout is. But comparing us to similar cities like Nelson, Palmy, Queenstown, Dunedin, our budget is around $50 per person per year. Palmerston North is up at $135 per person per year. So what we are proposing is to increase this just a little bit. We were hoping to get NZTA co-funding, which would have allowed us to get to maybe about the same as Nelson. Unfortunately, we didn't get the co-funding. NZTA did invest in public transport this year, but they mostly directed it towards Auckland, Queenstown, and Christchurch. But in our vote recently, because we've already allocated half of that money from Horizon's rates, we still have the option to spend that half. And that would allow us to get a considerable amount of new service. And what we think it would allow us to do is to get a second tide route that might be able to go to our next largest neighbourhoods like Whanganui East and Springvale. But the public will have a vote next year as to whether they do want to spend that money or not. So we'll need support at that time, and public submissions really help. Or whatever your view is, the public submissions will make a huge difference. At present, we have 2 Whanganui councillors for Horizons, Alan and David. Alan's very for this, so he'll be voting for it. David is dead set against. And we'll be trying to rally people to vote against it. So I'm generally trying...
Surnames? Sorry, David.
David Cossack, yeah. And Alan Taylor. Yeah. All right, so I've gone a little bit over time. I'm happy to stay around longer if anybody has more questions, but I also don't want to hold you up. So I'd love to just open the floor to questions now. Yes.
Whanganui's population is ageing, is that correct? So therefore the need may become greater.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's perhaps our demographic who needs to use their voice.
Absolutely, and it really helps because David's a very good person to work with, and he was actually supportive of getting the tide started. His main concern, he hears a lot from older people that don't like seeing the buses go around. They don't like seeing buses on the street. There are a couple of things. There are a couple of things that are really difficult about buses and that get people upset. One is if they see a bus with not many people on it. It does get people quite upset, and you can understand why. It's really good to know that there's a good reason why buses are the size they are, because people often say to us, why don't you use smaller buses, you save money. The truth is that 75% of the cost of running a bus is the driver. Your wages are your biggest cost. So there's not actually much difference in cost between driving around a van and driving around a 40-seater bus like we do on the Tide.
But I could say, having looked at that image of that woman getting out of that van with our age group, half of us wouldn't be able to get into it.
Yeah. So when you have a larger bus, so on the Tide, it's true. A lot of the time we have 4, 5, 6 people on the bus, but every day, at least 2 or 3 times a day, we have more than 13 people on the bus at one time. And that 13 usually includes someone with a pram, someone with a Zimmer frame, or even someone in a wheelchair. Now, when that happens on a bus the size that we have, the bus can kneel, you can roll straight on, and it doesn't take us much time to get you on and keep the bus moving. If we had a hiatus with a hoist, we'd need to stop the bus, the driver would need to get out, get the hoist on. We just simply couldn't run a predictable public transport network like that.
But of course the cost of parking and everything is getting so fiddly and expensive in Whanganui. I can't understand why older people are being anally retentive about seeing buses on the road.
Yeah. Well, one thing that would...
Stand in the middle of Wellington.
Yeah. Well, one thing that would really help...
The elderly using buses.
David lives a little bit north of here, but he's got close contacts in St John's Hill. So if there's anybody that lives in St John's Hill and does want to see buses, it really helps because David's biggest argument has been, well, people in St John's Hill, because their houses are worth the most, they will be paying the most for this bus, and the people who come to me from St John's Hill say they don't want to see the rates spent on this. So if I can find counter examples, then it really helps.
Sorry.
Yes.
I've got 2 questions.
Yes.
One Whanganui, one to do with Martin. I've been here 33 years
Yes.
from England. When I came, my daughter was studying in Auckland. We could go to Martin, get the train there. What's happening to that? Is there anything?
Absolutely. Yes.
Any train coming in the near future?
Well, okay, it's a big topic. Is everybody okay if I keep talking? If anyone needs to go, just please do.
I was going to ask about the train too.
Okay, great. So there's a few things here with the trains. I'll just point out, here's the Blue Street rail car. I don't know if any of you remember it. I wish I'd had a chance to take it. So it went until 1977. And we haven't had passenger rail service here. But of course we had the Overlander until 2012, which stopped in Martin. And of course the train now skips Martin. And it only goes 3 times a week. There are a couple of big challenges. The biggest challenge in my view is KiwiRail and the structure of KiwiRail. KiwiRail has been set up as a freight company and a sort of a cruise company. Essentially, they're only interested in passengers when it's a little bit like going on a cruise ship. And they're moving towards a model where you might pay $2,000 to do the whole of New Zealand and you'll get nice meals and a nice experience. But they're really not interested in a public transport user in the way that the Overlander used to run. The other part of that is that there's a very long and difficult process to getting a new rail service up and running. The only one that's been done since the 2000s, since the 90s, is the Te Huia train from Hamilton to Auckland. The timeline to create that train was about 15 years, and that's because you have to start with a business case. Then you have to get wording into the National 10-Year Rail Plan, which they only update every 10 years. And so we deal a little bit with KiwiRail at Horizons, and when we came to them, we actually proposed a new service for places like Martin, everywhere on the main trunk. And KiwiRail came back to us and they said, okay, well, let's start a business case proposal. So we did. The business case ended up being that because the frequency of trains between Wellington and Palmerston North is going to increase, there's going to be 4 trains a day by 2029, and because there's a similar number of trains between Hamilton and Auckland, our proposal was to run 3 trains a day between Palmerston North and Hamilton and connect with those other trains. It didn't get, in the last budget, just before National got in, Labour opted to fund the 4 trains a day between Palmerston North and Wellington. They didn't fund a progression of that business case any further for the middle of the country. We've still made a step towards it. That business case is still there, so it could be something we revive. But my general message is, I mean, I got into public transport because of trains, because I loved trains. What I've discovered is the timelines for trains are so long, and eventually we might get a government that is really serious, are as serious about them as they are about roads, and get these started. But for me, my goal is to work on those trains as a long-term project as best as I can right now, which means long timelines. And in the meantime, to look at improving public transport access now by bus. So this is Martin and Vernon. They were a private company that ran buses 4 times a day between Whanganui and Martin to meet those trains. And I think there they are at the current borough premises, because of course that's a bus depot. My proposal is the thing that we can do in a much quicker timeline, and a timeline that I'm sort of satisfied with, is create new bus routes. And for Whanganui, there's another issue here. So when you look at the Blue Streak, one of the problems with the Blue Streak is that it had to go through Palmerston North to get to Wellington. That's good if you're going to Palmerston North, but it adds half an hour to 45 minutes if you're just heading to Wellington. So road always has an advantage between Whanganui and Wellington, and for many years Railways road services were helping to solve that, because yes, you could take the Blue Streak once a day to Wellington, but there were 4 Railways road services buses that went through Foxton to Wellington, so it actually got you there faster. What we've suggested is a new route between Whanganui and Whanganui Railway Station. Now the advantage of this is that the train goes every 20 minutes from Whanganui Station to Wellington.
Yes, and I know people who drive to Whanganui and leave their car in Whanganui.
Yeah.
Even if they just go to Wellington overnight or for the day,
Yes.
they get out of their car and catch a unit or train into Wellington.
Absolutely. So that's if we had a bus that went a couple times a day. I'd like to see it as much as 3 or 4 times a day to start with, but it all comes down to budget, of course. But if you had a bus that went at least a couple of times a day return, then you would be on a bus for about an hour 45, and then you would switch to a train, and you'd generally only be a 10-minute wait. That means that you could get to Wellington in about 3 hours by a combination of bus and train. My argument is this is practical and feasible in the next couple of years to get started. And if we can get it started and we can get people on those buses, then we can make the argument for further improvements to rail. And so what we've actually looked at is a region-wide network of buses that would allow you to get a range of destinations. And you know, if we had a network and it went frequently enough, so looking at least 4 trips a day between Whanganui and Palmerston North, for example. And if this works as a network, then I could do my great dream, which I hope to do before I'm too old, is to take a bus to Palmy, to switch to another bus to Masterton, hop on the train, and go wine tasting.
Very cool.
Now, so the proposals that we put in the most recent long-term plan were twofold for Whanganui. So we had a proposal for upgrades to the Whanganui network, starting next financial year. If the budget goes in next financial year, and then we had a proposal to start building this network. We might not be able to build all of it, but we can at least get what I think is the most important triangle, which is more buses between Whanganui and Palmy, buses from Whanganui to Waikanai, and then buses from Waikanai to Palmy via the Whenua. And also a little bit of a start to these services for the Tararua, because at the moment they have nothing.
Why is there no bus service between Whanganui and Palmerston North Inland?
Yes, it's a good point. Yeah.
Yes.
But what you can do is get a bus into the middle of Palmerston, and there's where it drops you off in the square, you just walk across the square and you can catch local buses out to the...
That's right.
That sort of depends on the bus timetable to get you there.
Well, it's easier now. It used to be a difficult dance. It's a lot easier now because of Palmerston North's new network. The 101 goes every 15 minutes most of the day, or half of the day, and every half hour the rest of the day. So actually, it's quite a practical option now to take the Whanganui. I do recommend the Whanganui Palmerston North Horizons bus. I take it a lot now, and it's actually very good. It's only $6.50 as opposed to Intercity. But it does just have 2 stops, Whanganui, Bulls, and then it lands. But it lands right beside those buses that you need to take to the airport.
So where does that leave from?
It leaves from the main bus stops, and it leaves from UCOL every weekday morning at 6:45. This is the problem when you only have 1 bus a day. You don't have that variety of options.
I'm still asleep.
See, that train to Wellington from leaves at 6 a.m. and for anybody from Whanganui
Yeah.
who wants to catch that Palmerston North to Wellington train,
Yeah.
very early, you've got to be...
Yeah.
I just want
And
to
then-
see whether, sorry.
Oh, yes,
but,
yeah.
is there anyone else with a question?
Yes,
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
This lady here,
This lady
no,
here.
that's right. I've got one more.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Couple more questions.
I've got a couple of
I'm
questions.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One, I've never used the bus service in Whanganui,
Yes.
but I lived in Auckland for 45 years, so I
Yeah.
have a first-hand experience.
Yeah.
Now, do you get any discount with a gold card?
Yes.
You do. Yes. So you actually travel for free between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m.
Oh, okay, thank you.
On all of the buses.
Right, okay.
You need to have your B card.
You need to update your B card. You have to go to the Horizons office. So the B card is the card that you swipe on to get onto the bus.
Oh, okay,
You
right.
can pick one up from Horizons, and if you get it registered with your gold card, then it will automatically
thank you.
not charge you.
The other thing you were talking about, which I think is a great idea, increasing the service to 2 places. You specified Springvale and the other one was Whanganui East.
Yeah.
Now, how is that going to dovetail with the issue of the Dublin Street Bridge?
Yes.
So so you can't put in a whole new bus route if you're going to compromise the bridge. So how do you work that out
Well,
between all your various committees and subcommittees and
yes, yes.
and your
Have you got time
internal?
for it?
Yeah. So I can show you. Maybe I'll just highlight what might be possible. You know, just put the other things to one side. So just what we're working on in terms of a potential route for Whanganui East and Springvale. So here's the tide. This is actually an idea of what the tide would look like if it went all the way to Aramo, which is part of what we're hoping to the cemetery, which is part of what we'd like to do, and that new budget would really help us to do it. In terms of creating a new Whanganui East route, we can't actually put a bus on the Dublin Bridge. That's unfortunate because from a planning point of view, a route that went through the centre of town here and crossed the bridge would be great. But in the mid-2000s, they told us no more buses on that bridge because it has a lower weight limit.
I hate to meet a bus on the bridge.
So instead, the route would go past the elevator and Basia Hill and go up this way. Now, this wouldn't be the only routes to Whanganui East. We could also have other routes, but they'd probably be at a lower frequency. One of the advantages about this route is currently we run school services once a day, and they're focused on 3 locations: on high school, on City College, and on Girls College. If we created, but the students there only have one chance to catch the bus, and then that's it. There's no more buses that go past those schools. And what we're finding with the tide, it took them a while to work it out, but if you go to Victoria Ave at 3 o'clock, you will see that lots of people from West and City College have worked out that instead of waiting for their one chance bus, they can do whatever they like, and they can walk up to the Ave and they can take the tide. So we think that if we created a new frequent route that covered those 3 schools, instead of one chance a day, they'd have a chance every 20 minutes to catch the bus, and that means they could take it after sports. It means they could stay longer, and you know, now that every other day seems to be a teacher's only day or a something day, I never quite know when the bells are ringing. It just gives people more options. The other option with this though, which is a little bit tricky, is some of our school users live in Castle Cliff. So one other option is that you could end the current tide on Heads Road where we're planning this new route, and you could instead have the pink route go all the way to Castle Cliff. That would provide a faster trip for Castle Cliff, but it would also be more useful for those school students that live in Castle Cliff. But it's quite a difficult trade-off to think about.
Now, I'm sorry to do this, but Anthony has said he will talk to people afterwards, but we have got a cup of tea and biscuits waiting out there.
Oh yes, yes.
And we have the room up till 3ish or something, so please avail yourselves of the cup of tea up here, and the toilets are through that exit door over there. But before we do that, I would like to say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. And I just wanted to make a final note. So if you are interested in the potential for long distance services, that budget is allocated for year 3 of the long-term plan. So basically the budget will go in next year. Now, as part of this, so James came down to Horizons a month ago. It looked very unlikely that we were even going to have the budget that we'd allocated for Whanganui. The councillors looked pretty likely to vote it down because they didn't have the co-funding. Because they have a revenue policy that says if the central government doesn't give you an equal matched top-up, the money disappears. You don't spend half the money, you spend all of it or none of it. Now, James made a great case, and on the day we won the vote 10-4 to spend that half. It does require an amendment to their revenue policy though, and so that needs to be consulted on in Whanganui, and Whanganui needs to say yes to that amendment. Now, the crucial thing for the long distance services is if the amendment is passed, that in principle we are okay to spend money on public transport even if it's not matched, then we can start doing this. If the amendment isn't passed, it also rules out more long distance public transport, at least until the next long-term plan. So that's one of the reasons I'll be hoping that if people are interested in this, they can submit. And and they could just, you know, chat to their neighbours about why they actually would like this sort of thing, because there are people who think nobody wants this. So yeah, thanks
So
again.
spread the word, folks.
Yeah.
And thank you very much again, and just come out and help yourselves to come to your
And I'll be milling around here, and I can answer questions if you want to come up and say hello.
Yeah.